Dear sweet Canon 5D Mark IV, you are the last of a generation. You have a mirror lodged into your tiny little camera brain like a shiny reflective tumor. And yet you are still here, persevering with thousands of photographers all across the world. Your sensor still crushes low light performance and delivers razor sharp raw files, all while capturing luxurious 4K video. You have traveled the globe, met interesting people, discovered beautiful places, and delivered world-class images. And so, with a lifetime of accomplishments secured upon your legacy, we have to ask one very important question. Are you all done? Or are you just getting started? This is the Canon 5D Mark IV, and it represents the end of an era in photography. The mighty 5D series has long since gone mirrorless, leaving old SLRs like this one in the past. But does that mean that this camera is somehow obsolete? And perhaps more important, should you consider buying a Canon 5D Mark IV in 2023? Well, let's get into it. As with any review, I think it makes sense to start off by talking price. As of this recording, the Canon 5D Mark IV is still being manufactured today, and it retails for a cool $2,500. Now, this is a hefty price, considering that this camera has been around the block for many years now. One cannot help but make the comparison to several of Canon's newer mirrorless models. The latest R-type cameras pack in all kinds of hot new tech, all while coming in at a much lower price point. Sure, the 5D Mark IV has a seasoned track record, but when it comes to filling out your starting lineup, one must take careful consideration between selecting the MVP quarterback in need of a hip replacement versus the talented new rookie. And so in this lesson, we are taking a deep dive into this battle-hardened gladiator to see if it still measures up here in 2023. All right, so do you need the latest and greatest camera to take a good picture? The answer is no, of course not. If that were the case, then the entire history of photography would be filled with terrible pictures, because the entire history of photography is filled with old cameras just like this one. Now, here's the cool thing about that. 99% of the image that you take comes down to your knowledge, your ability to use the camera to the best of its ability. And that was true in 1850, just the same as it's true in 1950, just the same as it's true today. So knowledge is really the one thing that kind of transcends all technological boundaries. Yes, you can accomplish great things with modern cameras, but if you know what you're doing, you can also accomplish great things with really old cameras like this one. So don't count out these old dinosaurs just yet. You can still get really great images from them. And as we're gonna see in this little episode, this camera has been producing really outstanding images for me for many years. So before we launch too far down the rabbit hole, don't feel like you have to go out and buy the latest and greatest camera in order to be a better photographer. Really, that all just boils down to your knowledge. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Is the Canon 5D Mark IV good for portrait photography? To that, I would say yes, it is an excellent portrait camera. It has very fast, snappy autofocus acquisition, which allows you to really dial in your focal points, get the eyes nice and sharp. It's a very responsive camera. Every time you hit that shutter button, there's no lag, no delay whatsoever. The camera reacts just as fast as you can possibly think. If you give it a command, it reacts immediately to what you're doing. So I know that in the early era of the digital world, there was a big problem with hitting the shutter button and having to wait a minute for the camera to kind of come online or think or do anything like that. This camera is very responsive, so you're not gonna have any kind of shutter delay or any kind of waiting around on the camera. Now, as far as image quality for portraits, it does a really fine job. I've shot a lot of really great portraits with this camera and I've never had any major complaints about it. Is it my go-to portrait camera? No, it actually is not. My go-to portrait camera is the 5D SR. So anytime that I'm gonna do a portrait shoot, I immediately reach for my 5D 5DSR to capture the actual images. And then I'm reaching for the 5D Mark IV to shoot beautiful 4K video portraits of our model. So that way we have B-roll to accompany the images that we shoot for our tutorials. So this is, I would say this is a better video portrait camera than it is an actual photo portrait camera, but I know that many photographers have been doing really excellent work for a lot of years using this as a portrait camera. So it definitely gets full marks as a portrait camera. Is the Canon 5D Mark IV good for landscape photography? To that, I would say yes. I know that a great many photographers have been using this as their go-to landscape photography for very, very many years. It definitely performs beautifully in the field. It will never let you down. It is a fully weather sealed body, so you can take it out. It can get a little bit of rain, a little bit of snow on it. I typically don't operate in downpouring rain, and I certainly wouldn't chuck it into the river. But if you have any concern about any type of weather elements getting into the camera and ruining your shot, it's not gonna happen. This has a very, very nice, robust weather sealing. Again, it's not my 100% ideal camera for landscape photography. I once again revert to the 5DSR, which has that walloping 50 megapixel sensor to shoot 99% of all my landscapes. However, this is definitely my go-to cinematography camera for video production. Anytime that you go out on a photo assignment or on a project for landscape work, I always bring my Canon 5D Mark IV so that I can shoot accompanying video and cinematography to the actual photos that I capture with the 5DSR. We will definitely go down the video rabbit hole with this guy in just a minute, so hang tight and we'll be there in just a second. Is the Canon 5D Mark IV good for cityscape photography? Yes, I would say that it is an excellent camera for cityscape photography. As a matter of fact, our latest photo expedition that we took to Tampa, I brought exclusively this camera. I didn't bring any other camera. I shot all the photos and all of the video production exclusively on this camera. We built out a major tutorial on cityscape photography for Tampa Bay. Definitely be sure to go check that one out. And this camera performed very admirably. It was a really, really joy to work with. Again, normally I'm running my 5DSR when I shoot all of my actual photography, but this camera did a surprisingly good job because it does have a very high quality, low noise performing sensor. Now, as far as the landscape and cityscape photography goes, again, this is not my 100% go-to camera because it has a 36 megapixel sensor, which is honestly very, very adequate for about 99% of the things you could ever hope to do. I would say that the vast majority of all the images captured out there in the world ultimately just end up on the internet, and 36 megapixels is more than enough megapixel horsepower to handle just about anything you could ever hope to do on the internet. Now, I have kind of been in the business of shooting large format fine art pieces for galleries, homes, luxury hotels, and for me, the 5DSR with its 50 megapixel sensor once again kind of rises to the top of the pack when it comes to producing really large format, high detail fine art images. Now, can you get really large format fine art images with this camera? Yes, absolutely you can. I've shot with the 5D series all the way from the very beginning since the 5D Mark I, and in those days that was a 12 megapixel camera. And what you did if you wanted to create a future-proof high resolution image, you would set it up on your tripod in a vertical orientation and you would shoot a series of images to create a panoramic of 12 megapixel shots that could be stitched together to create a nice, beautiful, large format image that was relatively future-proof as far as being able to blow it up with huge amounts of resolution. As far as kind of a large format fine art camera, again, it doesn't really outperform the 5DSR, but that's a whole different ballgame because once again, I don't think that most people really need that much horsepower in a camera. 36 megapixels is really kind of hitting that sweet spot to where the sensor is able to achieve low light performance, high quality, and still have enough horsepower to give you all the kind of creative compositional cropping that you might want later on in post-production. Is the Canon 5D Mark IV good in low light? So the internet will tout its low light performance. It was actually one of Canon's sort of poster children of low light performance. I personally cannot attest to that. I don't really feed my cameras low light. I don't ever put them into a situation to where they're getting anything less than absolutely premium light. a nice sunset, a nice sunrise, maybe shooting in the midday, in the afternoon. It's always on a tripod and it always has plenty of time to soak in enough light to make a really great exposure. So I'm not really the person to say, yeah, I'd go out and shoot bands in dark smoky clubs and musicians and the low light performance is really great. I think if you look around on the internet, you'll find that this camera does in fact have really outstanding low light performance, but I'm not the one to answer that question. All of the situations that I've ever put it in, it's been able to handle miraculously. I've never had a problem with quality or noise or any of the other gnarly factors that kind of seep in when you have less than ideal lighting conditions. Is the Canon 5D Mark IV good for time-lapse photography? Yes, I would say it very much is good for time-lapse photography. It is my exclusive time-lapse camera. I use it for every single time-lapse that I do. It has very easy functionality built directly into the camera. You don't have to plug anything into it to get the interval timer to come on. You can shoot ultimately an infinite number of pictures until you run out of space on your memory card, or you can set it up to do a specific number of pictures. You can set it up to do a specific interval. It's all very intuitive, and I've definitely been able to capture a huge number of really beautiful time lapses with this camera. To that end, I would say make sure you get yourself a really nice fast card that has enough room to buffer, because if you're going to shoot 300 raw files all in a row in order to extract all of that beautiful quality out of those files, you're definitely going to want a faster card that can basically write all of that information without hitting the buffer and out interrupting your time lapse. So definitely make sure that's something that you keep in mind. Is the Canon 5D Mark IV good for video? Yes, absolutely. This camera was more or less purpose-built to be Canon's flagship SLR video camera when it first came out. It was Canon's foray into 4K video. This is the first time that we got 4K video into a DSLR. It kind of had some quirks. It had a few road bumps kind of coming along the way. Basically, the 4K acquisition is acquired by taking an 8 megapixel chunk out of the center of a 36 megapixel sensor. And what that does is it basically turns all of your lenses into a super telephoto factor because it's cropping in. And it was really difficult to get a proper wide angle shot for a long time. Now, Canon released a number of firmware updates that allowed the camera to use a wider and wider spectrum of the sensor so that your 35mm lenses were actually 35mm lenses rather than just being doubled all the time. So I find the crop factor to be a little bit tedious. I never did do the firmware update, so this camera still has the original super crop, which on the one hand is kind of cool because it turns all of your lenses into an extra bit of telephoto. So if you're into nature photography, wildlife, if you need to shoot things that are really far away and hard to get up close on, that crop factor is going to give you a huge extension, free, 100% free teleconversion with no loss of quality or light or anything right there in camera. And it's using number one, it's using the best part of the lens. It's just the center of the lens, so you're not getting any fringes around the outside of the lens. There's no focus fall off, and you're using the best part of the image sensor too. So the video quality in this camera is absolutely pristine. Now, that does come with one caveat. This camera does not, in fact, shoot any form of log format or raw format video. You're only gonna get kind of an MPEG variation. It shoots an MOV file, which is ultimately like a motion JPEG. So if you plan on going and cranking out 12 stops of dynamic range from your video, you can forget about it. That is not what this camera was made for. There are definitely circumstances where you just cannot collect all of that video, all of that exposure data in one single shot when you're shooting a video. And so I find myself shooting double exposures. And this happens a lot in the landscape world. We go out, we shoot tutorials out in the landscape. I'm standing in the shade giving a lesson to the camera, and then behind me in the distance, the mountains are all being completely hammered by broad sunlight. So there's a massive exposure disparity between me in the foreground and the mountains in the background. So that can cause problems, but ultimately you can overcome that by shooting your principal photography first, and then once you're done, you leave the camera running, walk around to the tripod, crank the F number down, lower the exposure, expose properly for the sky, and then it's a pretty easy fix to combine those two exposures in Premiere. So not gonna be the best camera if you're kind of lazy and you wanna be able to get 12 stops of dynamic range out of your video. That is not what this is made for. You definitely have to feed it ideal lighting conditions for the video production side of things. Does the Canon 5D Mark IV have eye autofocus? No, it does not. It does not have any major form of intelligent focusing modes. Most modern cameras these days have some form of artificial intelligence which allows them to focus on your eye, lock in focus so that you don't have to think about any of that. This has an old focusing system. It is very powerful, very precise, and very reliable, but you, the photographer, have to work the focus in order to make this happen. It has a really snappy autofocus system. I usually just put the center dot right down the middle. I'll capture focus on that, and then I'll kind of move my composition after that to make sure I get the composition that I want while keeping my critical focus point somewhere in the frame. Ultimately, it's kind of an older camera, and you as a photographer have to apply your knowledge and your skill in order to get this to do what you need it to do. It's not gonna do all the thinking for you. And for better or for worse, you may like that, you may not like that, but that's how it is. And finally, should you buy the Canon 5D Mark IV here in 2023? To that, I will say no. No, you should not. Because as of now, they are still manufacturing this camera brand new, and it costs $2,500. Now that is a very large price to pay for an old camera. This camera has been around a long time. Canon has since come out with an entire litany of new mirrorless cameras, the new R-type cameras that are absolutely phenomenal. They go leaps and bounds above the technology that's been packed into this camera from years ago, and a lot of them come in at a lower price point. So for the cost alone, I just don't think that this camera is worth investing in here in 2023. I think there are a lot better options that you can get for less money. Now, if you are interested in picking up an older camera on a budget, I would suggest the Canon 5D SR. That is my all-time favorite camera. It has an absolutely massive 50 megapixel sensor. It creates gigantic, beautiful images. It only shoots full HD video, but I can get around that because I'm not too worried about super high quality video. For me, I'm in the fine art world. I need to be able to produce ultimately really high quality images, and the 5D SR delivers those in spades. And those can be purchased for way less money. Those are actually going on sale for a pretty cheap price. They don't make them anymore, so you're gonna have to get one used. But if I were gonna recommend an older DSLR camera, if you're not ready to make the jump into mirrorless and you don't want to spend an arm and a leg getting yourself into photography, Canon 5D SR is an absolute monster of a camera, and it is a fantastic way to take a trip back down the vintage lane. So there you have it. Those are some basic thoughts on the Canon 5D Mark IV. Again, it is an absolutely wonderful camera. If you have one, I would say hold on to it, don't sell it. It's a great little workhorse, and it will continue to perform for you, I guarantee it. If you're looking to get a brand new camera, I do not recommend picking up a Canon 5D Mark IV. I recommend looking at the new R-type cameras. A lot of those are coming in at a lower price point, and they offer a lot more technology and a lot more quality than this old dinosaur is gonna be able to give you. Now, if you absolutely love old stuff, if you love the old way of doing photography, manual focus or acquiring autofocus by yourself, maybe this is not the worst idea. It is a very high performing piece of equipment, but it just doesn't pack in all of the new technology that the mirrorless cameras are offering these days. As for me, as of now, I have no plans of replacing this camera. It still does pretty much everything that I needed to do, and it delivers impeccable quality every time I pull it out of the bag. Now, I feel like that speaks volumes as to the longevity of the quality that Canon puts into its products. So no matter what camera you're looking to pick up in the future, if it says Canon on the front, I think you're gonna be in pretty good shape. All right, friends, as always, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you had fun on our little trip down memory lane. Now, if you have any interesting stories about your favorite camera, be sure to drop them in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. Furthermore, be sure to like and subscribe to this channel. We have a lot of cool new stuff coming up, and I don't want you to miss out. That's gonna do it for now. We'll see you in the next lesson.